Welcome to the first episode of In Conversation. After the Hamas attacks on October 7, it has been 3 weeks of Israeli bombings on the Gaza Strip and now ground attacks in which more than 8,000 people have been killed, and reports point out that one child is killed every 10 minutes. 1 million Palestinians are displaced and neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Why is this conflict unstoppable? And if this prolongs, what are the repercussions for the region and for the rest of the world? These are some of the questions we will unpack today. Our guest today is Antony Loewenstein. He is an independent, freelance, investigative journalist, a best-selling author and filmmaker. His latest book is The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. The book was released in 2023. It's widely acclaimed, and it's a global investigation into Israel's control of the Palestinians. It gives a detailed account of the use of Palestinian territories as a testing ground for weaponry and surveillance technology that Israel exports around the world. Antony, welcome to our show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
So can you briefly tell us about the situation in the region since October 7, briefly touching on why Hamas attacked Israel and why Israel is retaliating the way it is?
I guess my answer to that is we can only to some extent presume the reasons behind the Hamas attacks. Some Hamas leaders have talked about their reasoning, but there's still a lot we do not know. So anything I say has that caveat, of course. It's only a recent event. The attack on October 7 was brutal, illegal, in my view, utterly unconscionable, and killed huge amounts of Israeli civilians. But the context is important here, that the attack came from Gaza, and I've spent time in Gaza as a reporter myself. I've lived in Palestine for many years. I'm not there now, but I have lived there for many years in the past. I've spent time in Gaza as a reporter for the last 15 years, on and off. And Gaza is the world's biggest open-air prison. There's now 2.3 million Palestinians. There's very little freedom of movement. They often can't leave Gaza to go into Israel or to Egypt, the countries that border Gaza, for medical care. Every 2 or 3 years, there's a bombing campaign by Israel on Gaza. That's the context. And that doesn't justify what Hamas did, but the context is important here because history did not start on October 7. Like in any conflict, there is history and context, why something happened. Now, I would suggest that strategically, what Hamas has done is a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. The Palestinians themselves have been dispossessed and occupied for decades and have every right to resist occupation, but not, in my view, to kill civilians. This is a basic tenet of international law. It's not controversial. It should not be controversial to say that. But what Israel has done in response is exactly what Israel was always going to do in response, with the support of much of the Western world, US, EU, my birth country, Australia, and others, which is to give Israel carte blanche, to allow them to bombard Gaza, to kill huge amounts of civilians. But the fear I have, finally, is there's no plan here. What exactly is the plan? Is the plan to militarily destroy Hamas? Is the plan to level Gaza? Is the plan to make millions of Palestinians homeless? Which seems to me utterly counterproductive to any possibility in the future of coexistence with Israelis, which is inevitable and necessary. So I worry that the West giving carte blanche to Israel will actually cause much more tension and conflict, not just in Israel-Palestine, but in fact around the world in the coming years. Because what happens in Palestine never stays there. As my book shows, it bleeds into other issues around the world.
Yeah. In your book, you have extensively written about Israel's obsession with projecting itself as a militarily superior state through building, acquiring, and stockpiling weaponry and different surveillance tools. These are first tested in Palestine and then sold to different countries of the world. And Israel uses exaggerated narratives about the equipment it is promoting and selling. It uses glamour, which is often sexist, and the tagline it uses is tested in Palestine. And you also write somewhere in the book that the tools of colonization are attractive to a global audience. You've just spoken about how some of the countries and democratic countries are supporting Israel for what it is doing. Yesterday, we've seen the U.S. Vetoing the UN resolution, and but coming back to Israel, is Israel exercising control over Palestinians for is it retaining the territory by controlling Palestinians as part of a political ideology, or is it exercising control because it wants to establish its military supremacy in the world and strengthen its economy? Or third, or is it just a sheer display of revenge and arrogance?
I think it's sadly all of the above. I think what you're seeing since October 7, which is supported by pretty much the entire Israeli political establishment, with some exceptions, with most of the Israeli media, with some exceptions, and much of the Israeli public, with a few exceptions. There is revenge on the mind. There is a bloodlust. There is a desire to crush Palestinians, to crush Hamas, in this, in my view, deluded belief that somehow will restore deterrence, so that somehow will make Israel safer, when in fact it's going to make Israel much less safe. Israel has the right to protect itself and its citizens, and the majority of people who were killed on October 7 were civilians, including men, women, and children. But the actions of Israel in the last weeks, which is just indiscriminate killing, the leveling of neighborhoods. I was in Gaza for the first time in the middle of 2009. And that was about 6 months after something called Operation Cast Lead, which was a massive Israeli bombardment in late 2008, early 2009. And it finished just before Obama took office. And I was visiting there, and I've been visiting a number of times since. But in that first trip, I saw entire neighborhoods leveled. I saw Palestinians still living in their demolished homes because there was nowhere else to go. It was the middle of summer, so it wasn't raining, but still they're living in rubble. They're essentially living in rubble. And what's happened this time is on a profoundly different scale. Apart from the death toll, which, as you say, is already over 8,000, almost certainly is more because we don't know all the figures. It's a war zone, very hard to accurately assess how many people have died. Huge amounts of children are being killed, who obviously by definition have no connection to Hamas or terrorism. And the policy I see in some ways is very similar to what the US did in Iraq or Afghanistan. That the US went into Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. There was revenge on the mind. Now, don't forget, the US got rid of the Taliban in 3 weeks. They got rid of Saddam in 3 weeks. But that, of course, wasn't the hard part. That was the easy part from the US perspective. Then they spent 20 years fighting 2 insurgencies, and they lost profoundly, killing huge amounts of Afghan and Iraqi civilians, and obviously huge amounts of American troops. I make that as a comparison to what's happening now, because I think Israel believes that they can destroy Hamas militarily. And even if that's true, and we can argue whether it is or it isn't, then what? What's the plan? Who's going to run the lives of 2.3 million Palestinians? How do you not breed generations of more hate? People who have lost entire families, dozens of families killed under the rubble. It just seems like Israel has not learned any lessons from what the US did. And I thought it was interesting that Joe Biden in the last weeks, who obviously has been 110% behind Israel, gave a speech where essentially he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, learn the lessons of the US post 9/11, that we were, again, my words, too gung-ho. We were too violent, essentially. Now, of course, let's not forget, Biden was 110% backing all those US-led wars. Let's not forget that fact. And Israel's ignoring all that, have no interest in hearing that, because on their mind is anger, revenge, frustration, all of that. And to some extent, that's understandable after what happened. But it's utterly counterproductive. And what a good ally should do, the US or EU, would be to suggest caution, which is not happening.
You say that this is counterproductive, and you have given the example of how US invaded Iraq or Afghanistan, and you feel that Israel is committing the same mistakes. What then should have been Israel's line of action? What is the other alternative line of action? Today on October 30th, the New York Times, there's an article by Thomas Friedman who refers to the Mumbai attacks, and how the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh responded, because he chose not to retaliate with aggression, even though there was evidence of and complicity of the Pakistani agencies. But he used, diplomatic efforts and diplomatic pressure, and which the author says was much more effective. So was that an option for Israel, and why did it not use it?
I mean, it should have been, but of course, that's not the Israeli way. The Israeli way, as anyone who knows anything about Israel is, as frankly the US's policy is shoot first, ask questions later, right? That you don't really look too critically at yourself and your potential culpability and what you've done. It's not that dissimilar to, let's be honest, if that attack happened in India today, under Prime Minister Modi, we both know the response would be nothing like it was decades ago. It would be unimaginable violence in response to Pakistan or militants, whoever was potentially responsible. Now, I did read that Tom Friedman column, and I always feel quite skeptical about Tom Friedman in a way, although I quote him a lot in the book. He spent decades being, in my view, very uncritical towards Israel. But certainly in the last weeks, he seems to be, for whatever reason, I can't get inside his head, thankfully, he seems to be more reflective or cautious because he recognizes the threat, in his view, of Hamas, but also a far-right fascist government within Israel that has been openly calling, this is before October 7, openly calling for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. You have senior Israeli government ministers calling for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It's not my words, that's their words, calling for that openly, regularly. And it seems to me that too much of the international community, from the US to India, from the EU and others, aren't just turning a blind eye to that, they're encouraging it. So if you ask, why wouldn't Israel be more cautious? Because no one's telling them to be cautious. No one. Who are these voices doing so? Civil society might be, but at government level, they're saying, go for your life. Do what you need to do. We've got your back.
Yeah, let's talk about the government level and, the whole broader, this complex, global complex. Israel has been exporting its military technology to many countries in the world, and it has aligned itself on the one hand with despotic regimes in Argentina, Chile, Paraguay. More recently, in Sri Lanka, the same model was used, and on the other hand, you have the US aligning with Israel, or the whole example of the US-Mexico, the wall and the surveillance techniques being used, or how the forced migrants are being handled by the European countries. And does this kind of a broader nexus then mean that by promoting Israeli arms and surveillance technologies and industries, the leaders of the global north, or the so-called democratic world, have been complicit in promoting despotism, authoritarianism, hatred, and injustices, as well as promoting pervasive surveillance technology, or in other words, digital repression?
I mean, the short answer is absolutely yes, 110%. Let me briefly explain. Anyone who knows anything about US history since World War II will know that a key aspect of US foreign policy, from Latin and South America to Africa to the Middle East, is backing autocracies. That is the key aspect of US foreign policy. They frame it as backing democracy and freedom and human rights. No one in the global South believes that. they all laugh. It's a joke. It's a sick joke. And what is less known, though, which is what I tried to talk about in the book, is often the Israeli involvement in so many of those same countries and conflicts post-World War II, from Latin and South America in the 70s and 80s to Myanmar even today, even after, as one example, even after the UN found Myanmar was committing genocide against the Rohingya Muslim population in the last 5 or so years, Israel was still selling surveillance technology to the Myanmar regime. It had no impact whatsoever. The regime was committing genocide. They were selling equipment to Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. They're sending equipment to India in the last 10 years to commit abuses both within its own borders and certainly in Kashmir against the Muslim population there. When it's clear for anyone who has eyes and speaks to anyone both in Kashmir and elsewhere, that the reality, what India is trying to do in Kashmir, and frankly, much of India, is to create a Hindu fundamentalist state, which discriminates openly and proudly against non-Hindus, namely Muslims, but anyone else. Now, much of the world knows this. They either choose to turn a blind eye or they encourage it. And although there's no doubt that the 7th of October attack showed that Israel's much celebrated intelligence community failed horrendously, there's no other way to view it. 1,400 Israelis murdered is an unmitigated disaster in anyone's language, as 9/11 was in the US. But I'm saying that since that attack, I am moderately confident, as much as I can be, that the Israeli arms industry, in fact, will surge in popularity, not decrease, despite that failure, because so many nations, A, want to support Israel uncritically, A, and B, they will view it as Israeli surveillance and repressive technology was central in trying to bombard and destroy Gaza. And finally, even now, Israel is showing on its social media that they're testing new weapons in Gaza. They're battle testing as we speak, and they're promoting it on social media. So a lot of countries will see that and say, oh, I wouldn't mind a piece of that. That's how this system works.
So would you then say that the global policy, the world global policy, is actually dictated by the need for military superiority, and which is in turn is linked to the arms race, the arms lobby, and the whole money that is involved in it, and it's all about military superiority and about economy, and that then is framed as bringing peace and democracy. Is that it? And is this why the moral compass of the world is today shifting?
I think it's shifted and frankly has collapsed. I mean, I think one of the things I talk about in this book, and in fact in my last book, which was about the drug war, a totally different subject, about the global drug war and how disastrous it is for so many people around the world, is that the illegal arms industry and the illegal drug trade are two of the biggest industries in the world. They're worth trillions every year. They cause mass death, mass carnage, complete moral collapse in any sensible way. And yet both industries are thriving. The illegal drug trade's never been bigger. People using heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, whatever it may be. In the arms industry has never seen better days. I mean, after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, I've spent a lot of my time in my work not just writing about Palestine, but writing about the war on terror, about disaster capitalism, particularly in relation to people making money from misery, from war, including in Afghanistan, that many American arms companies were concerned, this is their words, that where we're going to keep selling our weapons. What are we going to do? The Russian invasion of Ukraine happens, an illegal, brutal, insane invasion, which continues to this day. The share prices went through the roof. And in fact, a few days after the Hamas attack on Israel, the share price of leading American defense companies went through the roof again. Now, I'm not saying there's a connection between what Hamas did and Lockheed Martin. What I'm saying is that there are people and organizations and companies that thrive from chaos. And in many parts of the US, many congressmen and women, Democrat and Republican, are so enthralled to the defense sector, they take huge amounts of money from the defense sector. The American political system is so broken, in my view, because so many politicians take so much money from these sectors because they want to have these industries in their own districts. And until that changes, until there is, in my view, I mean, I think the arms industry is immoral by definition. I think people have a right to self-defense. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a utopian. I think there are times where war can be justified or defended. I think that there are examples in history where that is the case. Like, I'm not a Quaker who says, you know, I'm never going to take up arms regardless. I don't believe in that. But in general, so many of these conflicts, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, are unnecessary, and they're leading to greater global instability.
So let's come back to the Israeli laboratory and what it is doing to the world. You write in your book that Gaza is now the perfect laboratory for Israeli ingenuity in domination. It is the ultimate ethno-nationalist dream, keeping Palestinians indefinitely imprisoned. And many countries are replicating the Israeli model. And you also talked about how India is borrowing from the Palestinian model and what it is doing in Kashmir. You write about that as well. You know, if Israel's experiments in Palestine have had some global saleability up till now, is it possible that some states are already emulating the Israeli model, but is it possible that many more could feel encouraged to do what Israeli forces have been doing in the last 3 weeks?
You know, one of the things that really worries me, and I thought this before the Hamas attack, but I think about it even more so now, is that what Israel has sold for years is not just weapons. It's selling an idea, not so much for money, but the idea of getting away with it. That's a really important concept. And you could look at that in examples like Sri Lanka, in its devastation in 2009, when it finally obliterated the Tamil Tigers after decades of conflict, which I might add was assisted by the Israelis. Now, the Tigers were demolished. Its leader was killed. The Sri Lankan military killed, we don't even know the number, 40,000, 50,000 Tamil civilians in a smaller and smaller and smaller area in the north of the country. You fast forward 15 years, there's been no accountability, no trials, no justice for those victims. Many of those leaders either ended up ruling the country again or have fled the country. There's no serious international pressure on Sri Lanka to change its ways, really. I mean, the country is economically collapsed, but that had nothing much to do with the conflict. It was for various other mismanagement reasons. I use that as an example, and there are so many others that I think a lot of other nations, often smaller, less powerful nations, look to Israel and say, you inspire us. They might not say this publicly, because sometimes they know their people will not approve. And look at the Arab nations, for example. In the last 10 years, traditionally, the Arab world should have been supporting Palestine. But in fact, the Arab elites in the last decade have essentially abandoned the Palestinians. Why? Because so many of them wanted to get the most sophisticated Israeli surveillance and repressive technology to repress their own people, because they fear a repeat of the Arab Spring. They fear a repeat of their own people demanding democracy and freedom and human rights, God forbid, right? So I think the Israeli model is not just selling weapons. It's not just selling spyware and missiles and instruments of death. That's part of it. But it's partly also, for some nations, and India is clearly part of this, an idea that you can thrive and grow as an ethno-nationalist state. A state that discriminates proudly against another group. In Israel, it's against Palestinians. In India, it's against Muslims. In Hungary, it's against Muslim refugees. There's lots of examples. And India and Hungary would look to Israel and say, you're a successful nation. You're economically strong. You're backed by the world's only superpower, the US. Yes, there was a Hamas attack a few weeks ago, and you're now fighting, in your view, a war of retaliation against Palestinians in Gaza. But you are a successful state. That is seen as an inspiration. And finally, one of the reasons I wrote the book was almost as a warning to say to people in the 21st century, do we want to have Israel as a model to be copied? Because more and more nations, from India to Hungary. They're behaving in their own way. They're not doing it because of Israel, but
Yeah.
they're inspired by Israel. And that worries me.
You know, you're talking about many countries being inspired by Israel, but at the same time, Israel is also borrowing from the models of other countries. As you said, you know, the US aggression in Iran and Afghanistan may have inspired Israel today. Or look at the case of India, where, you know, India seems to be leading in producing an ecosystem of fake news. And that was used to the hilt to bail out Israel, even though Israel's own media was pretty much free. Um, and so does it work two ways?
Both ways.
Is the
Yes, it does.
relationship?
It does. I don't want to suggest, and my book does not say this at all, but somehow Israel is this, you know, all-powerful force controlling other countries. I don't think that at all. It's just not true. That's a conspiracy theory, which is often rooted in anti-Semitism. I don't believe that. But the evidence clearly shows, as I detail in the book, and there's massive evidence online about it, that Israel has been for many nations an inspiration. Look, India is doing what India is doing. It's not doing it because of Israel. I've never said that, and I don't believe that for a second. But it's pretty clear that someone like Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi are ideological soulmates. They talk about it publicly. It's not really a secret. So it's not just a defense deal. It's the idea. And Indian officials have openly said what Israel is doing in the West Bank is an inspiration to us in India to do something similar in Kashmir. They're saying it in their own words. Since the Hamas attack 3 weeks ago, key Indian government officials, key members of the BJP have openly said, we support Israel 110%, and they frame it very much in their own context, that if Israel can do this against Palestinians in Gaza, we as Indians apparently have the same right to do something against, in their view, terrorists within Indian borders, with the expectation that much of the world will support them. And I fear...
So there are mutual interest there.
Yes.
So tell me one thing, despite promoting itself as an impregnable military force and as an invincible entity, and despite its superior military technology and, you know, horrifying surveillance techniques, this October 7th attacks did happen, and Israel was caught unprepared. So what does this tell us about the effectiveness of the Israeli military superiority?
You know, one thing I talk about in the book is that no system is perfect. It's still run by humans, still run by machines, regardless of a country claiming that they're invincible. It's always not true. There's a way. I mean, look at the US. 9/11 happened. There's no other way to view that as a massive intelligence failure. That's the only way to read 9/11. And the attack on October 7th is exactly the same. We're still finding out all the details about how it happened. We don't know. That's the caveat. We do know to some extent, from my understanding, that Israel was overly, as the US does now, overly relies on digital surveillance, much less on human intelligence anymore, as it was years ago. That a number of Hamas officials were able to fool Israeli officials. That seems very clear, that convincing them that in fact they wanted quiet and peace with Israel, when in fact some of them, of course, were planning a massive attack on 7 October. And also, I think, took advantage of the fact that this year particularly, Israel has been consumed before the attack with political turmoil. Netanyahu, as prime minister, is running a far-right fascist government trying to change the country's Supreme Court. There's been massive protests on the street. There's an attempt by many in the Israeli political system to essentially ethnically cleanse Palestinians. They were distracted, profoundly and majorly distracted. And also there was an arrogance, I think, that Palestinians will live as second-class citizens forever. We as Israelis have the right to do that to them, and then they're shocked when there's resistance. It doesn't justify what happened on 7 October, but it explains it. You cannot occupy a people forever and ever with no pathway to independence or self-determination and expect them not to be a violent response. This has happened in countless conflicts, from Iraq to Afghanistan, from Northern Ireland to India. This will happen, and it will keep on happening. And the mentality that the US has put forward, and Israel equally, in the last 2 decades especially, has shown what an utter disaster that is. I mean, the war on terror could not have been more disastrous for the US. And yet I would argue the US has learned literally nothing from that last
Yes.
20 years.
So one last question. So what are the lessons for the world today? Or in other words, what should we expect? And I'm sure the leaders are not going to listen to people like you or me, but what should we expect the world leaders to do at this juncture to bring back peace and calm and ensure safety of millions of people?
You mean Israel and Palestine, or more in general?
More in general, I'm talking about the world leaders.
Well, there's a few things. One, do not think that dehumanizing people for decades will bring you peace. And that could be directed at Muslims or Christians or Hindus or whoever it may be in whichever country. Do not believe that occupying a people for decades, whether it's in Morocco or Palestine or India, will bring you peace. It will not. Do not believe that demonizing people in the media will bring you peace. It will not. There is a sense, I think, of real arrogance and hubris at the moment, which is in many countries, US, India, my country, Australia, definitely Israel, Palestine, and other places too, that somehow believes that dehumanizing people, dominating them militarily, politically, will bring you peace. It will not. And I think I can't really think of any major world leader from anywhere in the EU, from Biden in the US, the Modi in India, my Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese in Australia, in Britain, Rishi Sunak, they're all singing from the same song sheet. I'm not even talking just about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, I'm just saying in general. This idea somehow that the only way forward is to blindly tie yourself to the US, that China is a major threat, that will overlook what India is doing to its own minority populations because India is not China. This is a recipe for disaster. I'm not sugarcoating China. I think China has a horrifically brutal government. It represses its own people. I'm not a blind supporter of Beijing by any means. I've written extensively I've spent time in China writing about its own repression. This is not a defense of Beijing. But I'm saying that if there is a desire, as there appears to be in the last years, to begin a new Cold War of sorts between the US and its allies and China, this will end badly. It can only end badly. If we've learned nothing from the first Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, which appears we have not, we are entering a new one. And if we overlook abuses in Palestine or India or Kashmir or somewhere else, we are destined to repeat history. I guess I would finish on this, that when you write about these issues, we like to think as humans that we learn from our mistakes. It's nice to believe that we do, and sometimes we do, but often we don't. And I think too often journalists are enthralled to power, whether it's in the US or India or elsewhere, to question those in power. And that is a massive failing at the moment, that too few journalists are speaking out. There are some that do, to be sure, but not enough.
Let's hope that will change and the journalists will continue to answer and that leaders will learn from their mistakes. Thank you so much, Antony.
Thank you so much for having me.